House.
That's Andrew O'Connor, our Perth reporter, who currently is standing outside the gates of Government House. He wasn't one of the 1,500 allowed in, but he was telling us about that throng that have turned up to welcome Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh to Western Australia at this state reception being held in the gardens of Government House. Joining me in the studio here is Professor David Flint, a monarchist, law lecturer and author. Professor Flint, of course the Queen is here to open CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which will take place tomorrow, the official opening. One of the duties that CHOGM has embraced this time around is to be looking at the very relevance and the purpose of the Commonwealth to ensure it doesn't become irrelevant. What do you think is the relevance and the purpose of the Commonwealth today, and what do you think about this group of eminent persons that are looking at this?
Well, essentially it's the commonality that exists between the members of the Commonwealth. They come basically from a very similar system, the rule of law, the English language, the sense of democracy that prevails within the Commonwealth. These are values which are common to all of us. And the Eminent Persons Group has come up with suggestions of how to strengthen the rule of law, strengthen human rights within the Commonwealth, they're proposing a commissioner for human rights for the Commonwealth. But I was disappointed when they said that, or they warned that otherwise the Commonwealth might go into irrelevance and become less important. The Commonwealth is an institution which maintains very high standards. Compare it with the United Nations. And I'm not criticising the United Nations, it's very difficult with international organisations in saying, well, you're a good member and you're bad, you've got to go out. But there have been situations in the United Nations where, for example, Gaddafi's Libya has headed the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The Commonwealth suspends members when they become undemocratic, and they've done that to Fiji, they've done that to Zimbabwe. And the United Nations doesn't do that. I think it's a very strong organisation in that regard.
What do you think about the calls, talking about suspension, what do you think about the calls in regard to Sri Lanka with these serious allegations of war crimes being directed at some members of the Sri Lankan leadership, that there have been some calls for the hosting of CHOGM in Sri Lanka in 2 years' time to be reviewed at this meeting, for this whole issue to be reviewed?
Well, they'll certainly have to look at that behind closed doors. But when you think of what happened to Fiji, which certainly doesn't have the same charges made against it, Fiji was quickly suspended. I think we overreact in relation to Fiji. We put demands on Fiji that we wouldn't put on other countries, and that may be because it's a small country. But I think the allegations made against Sri Lanka are certainly more serious than what has been alleged against Fiji, and it certainly should be investigated and checked, and in the privacy of the meeting, whether it is appropriate to hold the next conference in Fiji is another matter which they should all look at.
When you were talking as one of the cornerstones of the Commonwealth there, as its values and the shared values, how much could those values be tested by how the group, the Commonwealth, responds to these allegations surrounding Sri Lanka?
Well, I think this is a constant thing that happens in the Commonwealth and doesn't happen in the United Nations. You can do, it seems, almost anything and still stay in the United Nations. The United Nations is not irrelevant, and I don't see why the Commonwealth should be treated as irrelevant. There are going to be borderline cases, there are going to be questions of proof and so on, and internationally we can't always check on these things, but you're certainly right, there are allegations being made which need to be looked at. The Secretariat, the Commonwealth has been very quick to act in relation to other countries, rightly so in relation to Zimbabwe, which was acting appallingly. Fiji is a marginal case, and they're going to go to an election in 2014, and I think they're trying to do things, and perhaps we were a little too quick in jumping on Fiji, but Sri Lankan is a much more serious allegation which needs to be investigated.
How will that shape, do you believe, this meeting that Her Majesty is opening?
Well, I think behind closed doors people are going to make comments and raise questions. I don't know what the position, for example, of the Australian government is. That will be very relevant. And the Indian government and the bigger countries. Unfortunately, the Indian Prime Minister is not there because it is said that whether it's true or not, that he is upset because we don't sell India uranium, but we sell China uranium, and he feels that that's wrong. But that's another issue.
I guess that's the thing, is one of the elemental things about the Commonwealth as well. We are talking about 54 countries, vastly different cultures and backgrounds, perhaps different values in each of these countries, and yet to find commonality and stability constantly in a group like that must be a constant and enormous task.
It must be, but there is on paper a commitment to common values, and the Commonwealth is more honest than, say, the United Nations is in enforcing that.
That's a big word, more honest.
Yes, I think they're more prepared to say, look, you're suspended, whereas the United Nations never does that. Although there's commonality in the Charter of the United Nations, we know it's not observed. Its very beginning had to encompass countries, for example, the Soviet Union, who obviously wasn't the democratic state which the countries purported to be. And that's we have to be realistic in international relations, and these are not supranational bodies which have an authority over member states, and they can't do the things which you could, for example, within a federation like Australia in relation to parts of Australia.
While Her Majesty may be at the helm of the Commonwealth, she has to be above politics. How difficult must the line be for her to tread at a meeting like this, which she's opening, at this Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and there is an issue swirling around like this, so that this meeting which she opens, she is engaged with, and yet she has to be distant from an issue such as this?
Well, she's had long training at that, even in relation to our own country. The time of the 99 referendum, according to Philip Flood, in his memoirs, some monarchists were approaching him in the palace to try and persuade the Queen to support them. Well, we didn't, and I'd like to know who those monarchists were, because I thought they behaved very badly in doing that. But the Queen made it very clear during the referendum that whatever decision was taken, she would accept that, and she would honour it, and she would not treat Australia in any way different to whatever decision we took, and that was the right way for a constitutional monarch to behave. She is a superb constitutional monarch.
Although she didn't visit for the best part of a decade. From the early 90s through to 2000, we did not see her.
The Queen only comes when she's invited. And if the government doesn't invite her, she doesn't come.